The following interview was conducted with Garry Hesser on behalf of the Augsburg Archives for the Augsburg College Oral History Project. It took place on March 4th, 2015 at Augsburg College. The interviewer is Heidi Heller. All right, so my first question is how did you get interested in sociology?
Oh, I won't go into... I was a history major as an undergraduate. I used to ridicule my sociology major roommate because history dealt with the specificity and sociology with these sweeping generalizations that everybody knew. I think probably the sociological, as I graduated from seminary and was in seminary, two of my favorite professors in social ethics and education used sociology and sociological theory as much as a kind of a framework for what they did, which was my introduction into sociology. To make a long story short, I wanted to do a graduate degree in human relations at New York University, and New York University accepted me but didn't want to offer me any money, and I had a baby on the way. And Notre Dame, in a fit of generosity, thanks to the federal government, the National Defense Education Act, had received some major scholarship money to give out to people, and they bought me to become a sociologist. The degree I was going to do at NYU was a joint sociology and psychology degree, but Notre Dame had, and I lived in South Bend already, and to make a long story short, I was always interested in sociology because of these professors, and I'd become very involved in civil rights and fair housing and kinds of things. And so sociology was kind of an interest, but it never occurred to me that without a sociology undergraduate degree that any school would accept me for graduate work, which they did because of a unique set of circumstances. They were seeking a whole bunch of us who didn't have sociology undergraduate degrees. They were trying to compete with Chicago and Berkeley. So I became a sociologist, someone in the back door, and I was bought, and glad ever since.
Okay. So you had your Master's of Divinity before you got your Master's?
I had an undergraduate degree in a school like Augsburg in history and philosophy and religion, and mainly history. And then went to seminary and was serving a church in South Bend, Indiana when Notre Dame, which was there, came into my life.
Okay. All right. So how did you develop an interest then in experiential learning and service-based learning?
Probably since I was born. I was born into a family of educators, and my father was a Boy Scout leader volunteer, and so Boy Scouts became, along with the church, and you don't do Boy Scouts, whether it's Indian dancing like I did, or Eagle Scout and camping, without it becoming experiential, almost to the core. Kind of more specifically when I was in graduate school in sociology, and then you don't go into something applied like the church to ministry without it being very experiential. And I was up to my eyeballs in civil rights and issues like that with local priests and other folks. So my own learning curve and my own learning process was very experiential. But then when I went to graduate school and had to teach the compulsory class, my colleague and I, who's also stayed in service learning and experiential education for many years, and I taught a course that we were required to teach as graduate students, and we designed it with a interactive game in the class. We were labeled the Sesame Street sociologists. And so I guess, and then in summers I worked with to kind of support the family, worked in community-based kinds of things for the OEO project, for the War on Poverty. But probably more specifically, when I started teaching at the College of Worcester, my job was to be the director of urban studies, and we had 6 sites around the country, in Detroit, in Philadelphia, in Portland, and students, we call it urban semester. And the students went there and were involved in internships. Now we would probably call some of it community service learning, but it was basically community-based learning in challenging urban settings. And they returned to a little town like Northfield, which was Worcester, Ohio, and they basically literally walked into my office, two of them, and said, "You sent us off to the big world. We're back in the little town. What are you going to do with us?" And they challenged me and my wife and two children to live with them. And we, thanks to the students pushing me, said we organized a community service learning house. We didn't call it, was called community service. They designed a course on community with me, and we lived with students for the entire year and would have continued, but we wound up getting pregnant again and had twins, and 4 children was a little bit too much. So in a nutshell, that experience with kind of the conversation with students, which was a lot like what was happening, if you think about that, was 1971, 2, and that was when Augsburg had kicked in years prior to that, and I was involved in those urban settings in Philadelphia on the advisory committee, and I kind of finish the sentence, but that, so I didn't go in kicking and screaming. It was natural, but it was largely because of circumstances and students kind of pushing and saying, "Now what are you going to do with us?" Because at that point, except for these urban locations, the college didn't have an internship program, and so we were sort of making it up as we went along within the context of its deep commitment to these 6 urban sites where they sent students for a semester.
Were there a lot of colleges at that time doing that, or were you?
It was
kind of
starting to
forefront?
emerge when I became involved in the kind of early but second generation establishment of service learning in higher education here. I discovered that it was really during the 60s that colleges, and in fact, the Augsburg's role of founding HECUA, the Higher Education Consortium for Urban Affairs, and Joel Torstensen's role, he was on that first wave of people, because during the 60s there started, and you think about this, was the opposition to the war in Vietnam. Civil rights was still cooking. The sit-ins were in the 60s. There was a lot of discontent on campuses that was starting to take shape, and in different ways, different campuses embraced that. The 414 academic schedule was one invention, so students could be free for January term of normal courses. That was the original idea. It evolved in not very creative ways later. But so yes, there was, but it was almost, we would say in those days, experiential education was still marginal.
Okay.
And to end the saga, I'm at Augsburg because I didn't get tenure at Worcester, because the college where I wound up doing those and becoming a pioneer in service learning made a decision that, given its criteria for what they want, even though I was doing a lot of faculty research and publishing, they made a different decision, that a different kind of scholarship and a different kind of role when they got into a pinch as to they couldn't grant as many tenured positions that they thought they could, and I lost and somebody else won. Not to be bitter, I mean, I'm grateful for that loss. But that was an indication, no, it was not mainline. It was still marginal. The urban quarter programs that Worcester used were something you kind of did as an extra. It was a good thing. I mean, it was quite commendable.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense. So when you came in 1977 to Augsburg, was it because you didn't get tenure
That's
at Worcester?
correct.
So
Yes.
was there any other things that drew you here to Augsburg?
Well, the job description, my wife, who was not my wife at the time, but looked at it with me, and she said, "They wrote this job description for you." That, yes, I was looking for a job and probably would not have been had that not happened. I mean, on a biographical level, I'd also gone through a divorce, and so we were at a lot of places family-wise in terms of we need to make a change, and we needed to find an urban location where my former wife and the rest of us could sort of, we were co-parenting, and small towns usually aren't too easy to do that in. And so there were a whole lot of things about the Augsburg position. And the more I found out about it, and I discovered what Joel Torstensen had done, and the HECUA arrangement was so similar to my work with the urban semester programs at Worcester that it was, and they were looking for someone to be chair of the urban studies program and sociology role, and that's the role I played at Worcester. So, yes, it was kind of a match made in heaven for me, and many people think it was mutual. So, so that couldn't have been better and more timely. And another story is it was a total accident of history because if Joel Torstenson was forced to retire in those days. I got this job because of another form of discrimination. You had to retire at the age of 65, or he would have been like me. He would have stayed on and did, I hope, some creative work like I did after 65. But because he was forced to retire and the college said this was a terribly important position, they hired someone a year earlier than his retirement to work with him for a year. And due to some other strange accidents, that was possible financially, which usually wasn't the case for Augsburg to do much financially. And so I was able to come a year early at the time I needed a job. And
so everything lined up.
It was, the stars were aligned in strange and unpredictable ways. But so yes, and so to walk into a position that, two things, that the faculty had already decided, which the Worcester faculty had not, that experiential education, internships were not only important for urban studies majors, but for everybody at the college. To have walked into that, and the metaphor I use is Joel and the faculty had set the table. I've been feasting at that table ever since.
So it was at Augsburg, it was a campus-wide kind of thing? It wasn't just in the sociology department?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, what was brilliant about Joel was the sociology professor. He started sociology department, he started urban studies, he started social work. But in 1960, and that's the reference in there, in 1967, he got a sabbatical leave and he traveled around, 66, 67, and he visited Penn and Chicago, Rutgers, a whole lot of urban-based colleges, and he came back and he wrote this classic paper. And it wasn't just a paper, it was literally read by the faculty and voted on. I mean, and a whole curriculum emerged from that paper, the Liberal Arts College in the Modern Metropolis, that he wrote based on his research on campuses that were engaged in their communities as a learning site and a learning reciprocity. And so the faculty passed, and included, from the urban standpoint, every student could take up to 4 internships. That's over 10% of their courses could be internships.
Wow.
Most took the University of Minnesota another 15 years to even grant credit for internships. The Augsburg faculty, with Joel's leadership, and it was chemistry, it was religion. I mean, everybody, I wasn't here to watch the vote, but it literally was voted on as a principle and then operationalized in a curriculum that included 4 internships. That's 4 of your 36 courses. And and then a required urban, they called it an urban concerns course, but it was an urban studies course, and then provided resources for faculty in English, biology, to develop a course in which the urban setting was looked at, used as part of the course. So when I arrived in 1977, that decision had been made. In 68, 70, the faculty, the curriculum was done, and so I inherited a campus-wide, I don't want to overstate it, yes, chemistry had a different view of it, religion had a different view of it, but every department was encouraged to offer courses that had an urban focus, and every department essentially was required to offer up to 4 internships to engage students in the community. We were not using the language of service learning at that point. It was experiential education, and it was based on internships and urban studies programs.
So what was going on when you did arrive in 1977? What kind of things was going on in Augsburg?
Well, HECUA was one, in addition to the internship program, and in the early stages, Joel got a grant and they formed something called MUSIP, the Metropolitan Urban Studies Internship Program, which was like what we offer now in terms of college-wide at the, what's it called, the center? Yes. The Career Planning and Placement Center, which we support internships, and what Mary Laurel does in terms of community service learning. So there was an office to support that, and active engagement in the HECUA program. What is, I think I talk about it in the chapter, but another thing that was going on that was really, really important was what was called CHR. And it has its own story of emergence, and I don't know exactly the whole story about how Vern Bloom, who had been recruited here to teach social work, and at that point all the social work courses were still in sociology. They had split just as I arrived so that they could get accreditation. It wasn't a negative thing, they just needed to do it for accreditation. But Vern Bloom essentially was a social worker in the Model Cities program, and somebody else wandered in his office one day and said, there's a lot of people who live in who are in the prison and who live in apartments for disabled who could benefit from a college education. Let's start a program and offer it. And so CHR, which is called Conserving Human Resources, I don't know where that came from, but I understood it had a story, external and internal. And the two places that I was most acquainted with, at Travilla, which was a residence for people who were in wheelchairs, and at Shakopee Prison for Women and at Stillwater Prison for Men, they were already offering courses. And by that time, they were largely courses offered at those places. But when CHR began, it was a group of college students from Augsburg got in a van and drove to the prison with the teacher. So half the class were Augsburg students, half were Shakopee women, prisoners, or Travilla. So one of the most exciting, and I taught at the prison when I came. By that time, students weren't going to the prison. We were going there. So it didn't involve as many students as in its origin. But what was powerful about its origin was this was co-learning, in which Augsburg students studying criminology would go and take a criminology course at Stillwater Prison or Shakopee. That, to me, is almost the best kind of service. It's where you're co-learning, you're being served by the men and women in the prison, by helping you understand things that and you're serving them by helping to provide an education for them. So that was one of the most exciting things, and what I found in this file, I'll give you to take a look at, is literally a letter from Mo Mollenauer, who then wound up being an employee at Augsburg after he got out of prison, who wrote a letter to the student body thanking them for the opportunities to do this. And then Mo, after he got out of prison, turned to Vern Bloom and said, I need a job because nobody will hire me. And Vern says, we don't have any money. And he said, I'm in prison because I was a con artist and I took people's money. Let me try to raise the money for my own job. And he did. And Mo, essentially, when you drive around this city, without going off too far on a tangent, and you see metro mobility, that began at Augsburg College. Mo raised money to buy vans, and Augsburg students with work-study picked up those people at Travilla in wheelchairs because they retrofitted the vans to haul people, because nothing like that was being offered. And so Augsburg students, with the money that Mo raised, picked up people, brought them to campus, and because we had all these folks now coming to campus in wheelchairs, another guy named Batalden raised money to make the campus accessible and put in the elevators and the walkway. It's a complex causality of world, but that was going on when I arrived. And so in addition to Joel Torstensen and the Urban Studies program, there was a lot of stuff going on in a variety of different places.
I did not know any of that.
And I found an old file Joel had given me that I'd never looked at very closely, which was this letter from Mo when he was still in prison, an article that the students had written in the school newspaper about the CHR program and taking courses at the prison with prisoners.
So the impact is long and deep.
So it was not. I've always said that Augsburg, Michael might agree, is like the old let a thousand flowers blossom. You were pretty much free to do whatever you wanted to here. Not much monetary support, but it required your energy and enthusiasm, but a lot of freedom. Just not a lot of, I mean, it had support that was not monetary.
Right.
Now, we got paid to teach at the prison, and we had faculty release time in order to supervise internships and that kind of thing. So there was great support for the program, but again, to make the real simple point, compared to any other campus, and I've done faculty workshops by now at 60 different campuses around the country, compared to any campus I've ever been to, there was a wider spread faculty endorsement. This was not pushed on by a president who Campus Compact colleges said, you will do this because we want Stanford or Michigan State or St. Olaf or whatever to have this reputation too. It really bubbled up from the faculty and the students.
So has there ever been pushback that you've experienced?
Well, the
from
pushback
faculty?
would be financial. The
Okay.
pushback became, we had to cut back on funding faculty to supervise internships when you would have a department that didn't have very many students doing internships. When finances got tough, which they did in 1982, we almost declared financial exigency. The support to supervise internships was taken away. You had to teach more classes and you didn't get credit for supervising internships and that kind of a thing. I don't think ever by faculty, there may have been a few voices, but no president or leadership or faculty has ever said this was a mistake. It's been a pretty natural evolution, and if I've played any role in this, I hope it's just to keep greasing the sled. And I suppose what made it possible even to take it to the next level, and we reflected on that chapter, is that literally in 1980, to put it in kind of an oral history terms, I had been on the search committee for the person named Richard Green, African-American chemist from the Lutheran school down in Columbus, Ohio. And when Richard had barely gotten on the scene, and his associate dean, a woman named Pat Parker, had to have emergency surgery. And so Dick turned to me and one other fellow in the chemistry department to be the acting associate deans while she was recuperating. And during that period of time that I was the associate dean, I was given responsibility for internships because that was part of her load. And I decided to take advantage of that and kind of do some things she and I talked about. And one of that, I discovered cooperative education, which was a federally funded program that Gustavus and Concordia College up in Moorhead had been using federal funds to basically fund an internship office. Well, that's what we had to discontinue because of funding, so I, along with Bob Clyde, who kept rewriting the proposal, played a role in getting this federal grant. When it came through in 1983, finally, the dean turned to me and said, well, you'll do it, won't you? Because they'd put my resume, and I said, oh, no, I don't want to spend the rest of my career getting internships for business majors. I went home that weekend, and my wife, still emotional, and my wife said, who are you kidding, Gary? Augsburg is never going to have money to do this sort of thing again. You're going to look over the shoulder of somebody who takes the job and moan and groan and whine because they're not doing it right. What are you turning this down for? So I called him on Monday morning and said, is it still open? I want it. So that gave me not only money to supervise the staff providing internships, and then we got additional funding to hire Mary Laurel and really sharpen up the service learning piece of it. And so, but it also, at a time of literally almost financial exigency, I had money to travel. There was no travel money, but this was federal money that I could travel to support the program. And I became involved in the National Society for Experiential Education in Pittsburgh in summer of fall of 84. And literally walked into a national organization that had been instrumental in establishing experiential education and internships and the emerging service learning. And I walked in, and to give you an idea, I went to the faculty interest group. and there were 7 people who showed up. 4 of them weren't faculty members. They had come to talk to faculty members because no faculty members back on their campuses would talk with them. The point is, I was one of the few faculty members and virtually the only tenured faculty member from an institution that actively supported experiential education. And within 2 years, I became not only its vice president, but its president. Not because I had a whole lot of skills or knowledge, but because they knew they needed somebody with a faculty status from an institution that supported experiential education in leadership in their organization if they were going to be taken seriously in the rest of higher education. So the funding let me travel, become affiliated because of my status, not even because they even knew me that well. And as a result of that acquaintance, then I got trained in a FIPSE and I became a national consultant. So the accidents and the intentionality, but I always come back to say, if I hadn't been from Augsburg, an institution that supported experiential education, going way back to my predecessor and before, probably little of those would have happened. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. So where do you think Augsburg's foundation in that came from?
Well, I think I tried even to assert that in that chapter. Augsburg, Augsburg began as an educational institution to train preachers and teachers. Mm-hmm. So in its bones, even as it evolved into a liberal arts school and a coeducation one and became finally accredited in the 50s and became, I think you could say, unlike a Gustavus or a St. Olaf, which still sort of began as fledgling liberal arts. We didn't quite call them then, but it's colleges. Mm-hmm. So in its kind of DNA, it originally, and it had a seminary here until the 50s. That'd be one explanation. The other is, by accident almost, they got located in a city. And it was because they got kicked out of their building in Wisconsin, you know, part of that history. An urban pastor up here talked some city fathers into saying, well, we need a college over here too besides the university. Look over in St. Paul. They got 4, Hamlin. What are we going to do? My point is, our urban location, again, almost an accident, because this was a bunch of Norwegian farmers who supported this school. Virtually none of them lived in the city, but here was this Norwegian church in Minneapolis that got them to come here. So I think it's as Joel Torstenson, I think, would say, it's our location. If you're in Northfield or St. Peter or Moorhead, it's not that you are disengaged with your community, but the community's just not really in your face all the time in the reality of that. And you read stories. We were just talking about, Kristen, the that project.
Histriopolis.
And, I mean, if you start a college in the middle of Snooze Boulevard and the West Bank, which is home to immigrants, well, you're an immigrant college yourself. Okay. But that's different than most all the other Protestant liberal arts colleges were established in small towns, partly because Protestants were scared of cities. Catholics had cities. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but so I'm not quite sure. I mean, the 2 faculty members, maybe 3, but the 2 who had the most to do with Augsburg claiming its urban location were Joel Torstenson, who I write about, and Carl Krislock, who was a history professor, who also, I want to think both Carl and Joel went here as students. I know Joel did. But inspired generation of folks to affirm the city, its political machinations and history and reality. And but And again, and because it was more of a teacher education, that the applied experiential just wasn't foreign. I mean, it wasn't a bad thing. And so things like social work and education were just natural things, and it wasn't going off to small town Northfield. Now that's biased, but I don't know exactly, except those would be the variables I would attribute.
Okay. Backing up to your time when you were serving on the National Society for Experiential Education, the president, what do you think your experience on that, you talk about what you were able to give to them, but what do you think being on that brought back for Augsburg?
Okay. Well, I mean, in a very direct way, because the conference I went to in Pittsburgh held up that this FIPSE grant, the Fund for Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, to do the development of experiential education, I sort of brought back to Augsburg two things, I think. One is an ability to say we're on the right track. Other folks are getting aware of this, and the second thing is I began to learn how the emerging community service field was happening, and so was able very quickly to find and to get funding so we could hire Mary Laurel True. So that put me in touch with sources of resources and funding. And I think the reason we were asked to write that chapter, or I was asked to write that chapter in the book, is what it gave us a chance to tell Augsburg's story on a national level. When people, I mean, I was introduced as the president who was a professor of sociology at Augsburg College, and I was able to tell that story. And when I was trained as a consultant and literally used the money to buy myself into the consulting training, because they'd already chosen the next round of consultant trainees, my point was, well, I'll get myself there with the money to be trained, and what we'll do is we'll use Augsburg as kind of a case study of developing further experiential education. I don't know whether I'm answering your question, but I think you're saying, what did it bring back?
Yeah.
Well, it gave us I think it's fair to say that the reason we keep showing up on all of these national things is certainly because of the number of students we have involved and that kind of a thing. But it's also because I've had the opportunity to become nationally recognized. I mean, I was given the National Award in Service Learning, and in not only Mary Laurel's work, but when you do workshops at 60 or more places, it shows up when people ask who's doing service learning. Oh, it's not because they have seen our programs, but oh, that was that guy, that professor who did the workshop for us or at the conference. So I think, that sounds a little vain, but I think it's because of the almost accident that there weren't that many faculty who had institutions that supported them,
Right.
who were able to do that. And on a career basis, I made a decision. I'm going in 2 days to Detroit to visit my friend that I was doing research with. When all this funding happened, to backtrack, I had, in the summer of 1980, I had been doing research in Worcester with a colleague studying neighborhoods and housing. He was still at Worcester. I came here when I didn't get tenure, but got a grant, and we hired Augsburg students to do a summer research on housing and neighborhoods. We interviewed 400 people, families in Minneapolis. And so we had done all this data collection to compare Worcester, and now we had a big city to compare this to. And along came this job opportunity. And the dean said, "Do you want this job?" And I said, "No, because I want to come back and do my research," because we'd spent that summer collecting data. the decision to take the co-op job meant I had to turn to George and say, the book's yours. I'm not going to have the time, and I can't take the sabbatical that I was going to do it. So you could say selflessly, but I gave up that research career to do this. But that was more consistent with who I was anyway. I mean, I loved the research, and I loved the opportunity of having Augsburg students out in the community interviewing and doing a study. That was really important. And it was a bit of pain to let go of it for ego, if nothing else. But what the opportunities at Augsburg took me in a quite different direction, and because that's what Augsburg needed and wanted, and I certainly have benefited immensely, even more than the college has. But it's a chicken and the egg thing. I think the college has much of its national reputation because I had the good fortune to occupy those positions and do that consulting over the years.
And have an impact.
Yeah, and a reputation. I mean,
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
I've done a halfway decent job when I've done the workshops, and the workshops also usually make use of what we're doing at Augsburg.
So during the 80s, and you talk about On the Shoulder of Giants, from 1984 to 1989, you were talking about you spent most of your time on experiential learning. That was when you were working as the president and vice president, or on the board.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of changes happened here on campus?
Well, during that, during that period of time when we had the cooperative education grant, I continued to work full-time as director of cooperative education and wasn't teaching much sociology at the time. And then as the funding for the federal grant kind of wound down, we'd found funding for Mary Laurel True to expand the service learning, and we institutionalized with the internships and we called it the Center for Service Learning and Internships. And Lois Olson became the director of that, and Mary Laurel worked with her. We've now split that apart, the Stroman Center and the Sabo Center. But during the period you're asking about, I'm now trying to well, I guess one of the biggest things that happened is that we evolved to, and the new curriculum was written, and that had two important kind of bookends, so that every first-year student in the new curriculum is required to take a course that meets the Augsburg, we call it the Minneapolis, what do we call it? We call it Engaging Minneapolis. And so in a new iteration of what the urban location would mean, we had a curriculum that had, for first-year students, we'll have Engaging Minneapolis to introduce them to the learning opportunities available in the city. We'll keep deepening, and Mary Laurel will develop course development and do faculty research with people in courses. And then the other piece was that we added in the late 80s, and well, I guess it would have been a curriculum in the 90s, that had a required Augsburg experience in order to graduate. And we more broadly defined what the Augsburg experience would be, but there were only about 2 or 3 colleges in the country that were starting to have an experiential education requirement for graduation. Mm-hmm. And the internship would be one way to meet that. Study abroad would be another. Community-based research would be another, in which you did the research on and about a community issue, but you also made a presentation to community. Expanded courses that had service learning, or a student could design his or her own experiential graduation. So, and I returned to the sociology department full-time in urban studies, and what I think was very important is many of the schools, Gustavus, Concordia, that got these cooperative education grants, when the money ran out, the programs dried up. Augsburg, and I really credit because it was not an easy decision, is that when the money, now I returned to teaching full time, but we institutionalized that with the Center for Service Work and Learning, we called it, and the college continued to support the staff that had been hired using federal money to start with. So Lois Olson and Mary Laurel True remained as permanent full-time. We called it, it was institutionalized. And that's probably the most important thing that I'm the proudest of, is that even with pressing financial aid, the college began to say, yes, this truly is who we are, and we can't let this go when the federal grant goes. And so Sandy Tilton, who still works in the Stroman Center, Lois Olson directed it in the evolution, and Mary Laurel is still here. They're here because the college said, no, we can't be Augsburg College without these experiential supports for faculty to do this. Do we go as far as we could and should have? No, probably. I mean, I know that, but
You'd like to have seen more pushed?
well, yeah, I think the lack of funding is just pure and simple. But given that, the fact that it's institutionalized and support is there, I think is a testimony to the college and the leadership.
And it still remains today. So.
Yes,
Yeah.
and is maybe even stronger because when we split the Stroman Center out to handle the internships and the career service part of it, and the Sabo Center to intensify our work in public service and public involvement, reflected Paul and his work when he came in as president. And probably, I guess one other footnote to that is, Paul says this, and I think he's quite honest, he was attracted to Augsburg College, as were the other candidates when I recall their speeches, because of its embracing of its urban location. His competitor was a person who was the provost at the University of Colorado in Denver. Paul wanted, because of his own interest, to be at a school. He was already at a school, but it wasn't as... He was at a school in Illinois that was committed to community service. But he was attracted to Augsburg because of all the Lutheran colleges. We were the one most engaged. So you could say, and he does say, he came here because he knew the college was already committed to community engaged learning.
And that's current President Paul Peeble?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So what do you believe your greatest challenge in your work here at Augsburg has been?
On a personal level, I think the greatest challenge is to stay focused. There's so many opportunities, and my own personal inclination, I would sometimes describe myself as an intentional dilettante. I get bored very quickly and like to go in, or my wife says I have trouble walking in a straight line. And so on a personal level, I think the greatest challenge was to stay focused and see things through before I jump off and take on something else. And that, I think, is kind of the institutional challenge as well. So we probably have not been maybe as good for each other. The institution, with limited resources, says go as far as you can go, but that's all we can support at this point. That's kind of a vague. I think, say it again.
What do you believe has been your greatest challenges in your work at Augsburg?
Yeah. Well, again, I think personally, when we, for example, embraced the new curriculum, we had to give up, for the political decision making, the old urban studies course. There used to be a required course in urban studies that went clear back to that curriculum in the 60s and in the 70s. And we identified the engaging Minneapolis and the Augsburg experience as requirements. And I was willing to not fight that loss because I think my biggest sense of failure, or the biggest challenge we face, is the engaging Minneapolis course very quickly, for practical reasons, became first just a service learning course. And it didn't really develop what the original, it specified very clearly that the introductory courses would introduce students to learning opportunities in the city, not just service. Mm-hmm. So if you were a history major, it would probably introduce you to the accessibility to the History Society, the Hennepin County Historical. If you were a chemistry major, it would introduce you to research and stuff going on at 3M and Ecolab. It wasn't that you would always be doing service. And so first it became identified with just service, which was not bad, but it did not meet the intent that Joel Torstenson and what I believed in was, we want to equip people to understand cities, how they work, and how people as citizens need to be actively engaged, not serving people, but politically and socially making the community a better place by working together with the people that live in it. And so even to this day, the Engaging Minneapolis course doesn't meet what the criteria were, which was to introduce people to the learning opportunities and how that discipline of the course you're taking contributes to an understanding of the city. English, literature, history, chemistry. That is the huge weakness. And when I retired and became disabled professor, when I became less and less engaged with the actual curriculum, my own personal sense of failure and institutional, and the biggest challenge is, how do we really do with the Engaging Minneapolis what it was designed to do? And worse yet, it even shifted to the fact that the AugSim piece, so again, it's going out, it just has not developed that. The graduation requirement of the Augsburg experience, I think, is still pretty solid. That needs always more attention and support and more opportunities. We're starting to do more support for internships. We've now got a major fund and a grant to give support to people who are doing unpaid internships, so more people will do internships. So that, to me, is the biggest challenge, is to simply make the curriculum bookends, the Engaging Minneapolis and the Augsburg experience, be what they were designed to be and intended to be.
Okay. On the flip side, what do you hope to be remembered for? What do you hope your legacy is here at Augsburg?
Well, I say it a lot, and I think I really mean it, is I hope my legacy is that I contributed to and helped the Torstenson platform continue and deepened it in some kinds of ways, but in a broader sense, hopefully my legacy is that I played a role in fleshing out. I mean, I use the metaphor of Joel Torstenson and Carl Krislock and Miles Stenchel set the table, which I deeply believe they did, because the curricular pieces were all in place. And that hopefully my legacy is that I helped to put a lot of good food on the table for Augsburg students to feast at and to take advantage of as they dined at Augsburg, to milk that metaphor too much. And I think probably this, in my final role as the Sabo Professor of Citizenship and Learning, that hopefully we were able to transfer and continue to translate community engagement on kind of two ways. Community engagement as looking at the city as a place to learn, but to do it in a co-learning sense, which also helps you understand what citizenship is about, is that citizens engage each other in problem solving. Citizenship is not about me fixing you, and so hopefully that's an emerging role in having Harry Boyd and Elaine here from the Center for Citizenship and Democracy is giving us a way to keep expanding Joel Torstenson's vision, but very consistent with it, that we're trying to train sounds like equip every Augsburg student as being an active citizen who looks at whatever issues they think the city or community where they live, and equip them to be active agents, to use the language of Harry and folks, in building community. Joel Torstenson's basic theme was we need to equip every Augsburg student to be a community builder. We don't know where people are going to live, but we know that communities are dynamic, organic, evolving, and so through internships, through engagement in the city, through service, and whatever modes we would call experiential education, students from Augsburg are better equipped to be community builders, or Harry would say civic agents. And that agency for Augsburg students means not just passively voting, but it means community building. And whether you're a banker, a lawyer, a teacher, or a doctor, we hope an Augsburg student, and I think by the establishment of the Sabo Center, by bringing Paul Pribenow here as president, for whom that's a key theme for him, that we've basically made that legacy, not Gary's legacy, or even Joel's legacy, but it has become, whether you buy quite into the motto, is we are called to serve our neighbor. That may not have been the logo, the acronym I would have chosen, but we are called to be active community builders the rest of our lives. And so hopefully I've contributed to that, and the college has increasingly bought into it. It certainly has become our reputation. Whether I had anything, which I didn't, the other legacy of Joel Torstenson was consistent with my own values, which is deep belief in a multicultural community that valued and honored people of all beliefs and reputations and ethnicities and colors, and that the college's new demographic profile, which is quite unlike any other Lutheran or most other Protestant-related liberal arts colleges, represents a foundation, but our urban location makes that possible too, where that diversity has happened and is happening. I don't know, that's kind of rambling, but so that's a legacy that I don't think I had any direct contribution, but the college was located in and a better place to receive all this diverse student body that we have now, and hopefully be a place that they are equipped to do community building.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you, Garry, for your time.
You're welcome.